For everyone who's just getting into the room right now, this is our panel specifically about the technical requirements for FedRAMP. And I kind of have an all-star cast over here, and I'm going to give them all a chance to introduce themselves. Maybe starting with you, Maya.
Sure. My name is Maya Kaczorowski. Hey, Sai. I just started a company called Oblique, which is in the identity space, but I previously worked at Tailscale, GitHub, and Google Cloud.
Hi, I'm Ryan Fuller. I lead the global public sector infrastructure and security team at Scale. Prior to that, I was at Boeing. It's kind of where I got started with containers.
Ken McDonald. I'm a distinguished architect at Checkmarks, responsible for their multi-tenant code-to-cloud platform. You know, we work in the container security space as well, and so my main task very recently was to get us through FedRAMP certification. So.
Sweet, and I don't think I introduced myself, but I'm Aditya. I work in product marketing at Chainguard. And maybe before we get into kind of some of the discussion, I'm curious who here is maybe considering starting their FedRAMP process, but hasn't actually gone down the path at all. Maybe raise your hand. All right, we've got one hand in the back, two hands in the back. How about if you're kind of midway through the process of ATO or working on your readiness, audits, everything else? And then maybe lastly, anyone who's already FedRAMP low or moderate and looking to move up? Okay, good overlap. Great. We'll get started then. Maya, do you want to give some sort of like overall market context on FedRAMP?
Absolutely
some
do
of the
that.
research you've been doing?
Yeah. So the context that Aditya is referring to is that I realized recently, I was like, oh, the FedRAMP marketplace data is all public. It's just this database. But I haven't seen like a good analysis of it. So I dumped out all the data and then ran a lot of pivot tables to figure out what I wanted to know about FedRAMP. So FedRAMP, there's a couple different ways you get FedRAMP for folks who know in this room. Historically, you could have gone through the JAB, which is the Joint Authorization Board, which is when a body made up of multiple CIOs in the government, including like the DoD, reviews your product, or you could have the sponsorship of a single agency. And that would pull you through the process. They got rid of that process a couple of years ago, and now it's only the sponsorship of a single agency. And as of yesterday, that's actually probably changed again. So the process looks a little bit different yesterday, as of yesterday. They're doing a lot of work to modernize the process, or they were already doing a lot of work to modernize the process, so you could have your requirements in code. There's like a public repo you can go look at of like what a FedRAMP application looks like in this new process, which is super cool. Like that's a very, people in this room probably think of it that way, but not necessarily how the government was thinking about it before a couple of years ago. One of the trends I saw in the data was that the number of FedRAMP authorizations has gone up over time, but not necessarily like as steeply as you'd expect. The number of FedRAMP uses has like skyrocketed. So with the concept of reuses, where one agency can reuse another agency's paperwork and the research that they've already done, the amount of FedRAMP usage, which is what one of the pieces of data in that table, has really skyrocketed.
That's great. And when we think about some of the technical requirements for FedRAMP ATO, two of the things that we run up across a lot with customers and prospects are FIPS and vulnerability management. And maybe, Ken, I thought you could give a little bit of background on that really dirty four-letter word that people seem to hate and why it matters so much.
So for those that aren't aware, FIPS is the Federal Information Processing Standards. Basically, the government regulates kind of the requirements around building cryptographic modules. And there's the notion of being compliant versus actually being verified or accredited. So it's an interesting world with a lot of gotchas, and as soon as you start down the path, you find that there's a lot of hidden nooks and crannies to swapping out any crypto modules that are approved and validated. Just because you meet the requirements don't mean you're accredited, which means you lined up in the government offices to get a rubber stamp to say your crypto has been reviewed. It's very time consuming, and it's not achievable, at least not easily achievable with any sort of open source or DIY approach without getting some help from, Chainguard or equivalent.
Yeah, and for either you or Ryan, like what are some of those gotchas that you run into, like from your personal experiences at Scale and Checkmarks?
So from my perspective, I think the shocker for me was when I found out a lot of the hidden gems with Amazon. For example, just because they say FedRAMP certified for high EKS, you'll learn quickly that none of the add-ons work. So as soon as you add more than one node, you are now pulling in an image automatically. That's not FIPS. It's not clean. And then you're running on AMI that isn't FIPS enabled. It's like all the way down the stack. And then there's different endpoints. And then, so that's number one. Number two, your code likely has little areas, especially depending on how big your code base is, how old it is. You're going to hit MD5. You're going to have someone that thought it was a great idea to use DES. You have things blowing up as the runtime kind of pulls out these old crypto modules. And I think we hit literally every snag along the way. We've resolved them.
Ryan, you gave some chuckles along the way. I'm curious what's behind the smile.
Yeah, I mean, there's a few gotchas, and a lot of them are more so on like the compliance side, right? So you think, and FedRAMP and like the DoD PAs kind of go hand in hand, so I'll kind of use those interchangeably here. You would think like once you go through the process and you get the accreditation, that means the next time you get a customer, they're just going to look at your body of evidence, give you the contract, they're going to onboard, it's going to be fine, right? But typically, like for whatever reason, they don't trust who did it. They want to go through their own process. They have their own pathways to show evidence, to show vulnerabilities, and go through that. So things that are very simple, like false positives, that like are very clearly not there and don't exist, like a kernel level vulnerability flagging in the container, right, which happens a lot of times. They want screenshots or evidence to show that that is a false positive. And the ways of reporting that are different per customer, right? So reducing the total number of vulnerabilities like scales exponentially because every time you go in a new environment, a new customer, you have to go and provide that evidence of why it's a false positive through different reporting mechanisms. Yeah, and to iterate like on him, the level of detail they go into to verify the FIPS modules and validate them, the auditors really dive into that, and they want to see that in paperwork. So even if you are using a FIPS algorithm, if it's not one of the compliant, approved versions, you'll get hit on it, even if it's a newer variant as well, which is a little frustrating.
And I think, Ken, checkmarks, you all tried to sort of build your own FIPS applications in-house. Is that right? Like, what are some of the roadblocks you ran into in that process?
Actually, we did not, because I went very quickly to. So let me start from the beginning. We did this effort out of plan, and we had no resources lined up to work on building FIPS images. So we did a very quick proof of concept, and it was a taxing kind of event. To first, you needed to have a base image that had an accredited OpenSSL. OpenSSL is the most common piece that the crypto relies on. And if you don't have that to build on top of, and in our world we have 120 unique images, about 40 different base images. And just looking at the effort it took to STIG and AMI to run on EKS, we would have never met any sort of like milestone while keeping our plans intact to keep product features kind of pumping out the door.
Got it. For those in the room who aren't familiar with STIGs, I don't know, Ryan or Maya, if either of you want to give a little bit of background on what those are and why they matter for FedRAMP.
Yeah. So STIGs they're a necessary evil, I think. And I spent last week, actually, there was a system where we couldn't use a containerized version of something, so I had to go in and stick a box and burned a whole day implementing all these checks. So it's a security technical implementation guide. So they're a checklist of controls you have to meet for largely an OS. So there is for applications. There's different networking equipment, but generally you do it at the OS layer. The issue when it comes to containers is they wrote the STIGs for an OS, for Linux, like Red Hat is the one that's most common in the DoD or the government space. And then when containers came out, they wanted to apply those to containers, right? And they didn't make sense. The controls don't make sense. You can't get evidence of it. Like a lot of things, the hardening steps just don't matter in that world. And they've slowly caught up, but it is a constant battle to have that evidence of the STIG'd environment. One thing that Chainguard's made nice for us is those containers are STIG'd kind of out of the box, so we can point to the evidence. You guys have the write-up of what isn't applicable to the images. That makes it very easy to have that conversation with the auditors and the government.
Got it. And the other thing we talk a lot about with customers, which Orion you alluded to, is a little bit of the vulnerability management side. Maya, you've done a bunch of work and research around this, both in professional, academic, and personal lives. Can you share a little bit of what you've learned?
Sure. I don't think anything academic in the real sense of the word academic, but I spent a lot of the fall talking to a lot of security leaders, almost 60 different CISOs throughout September, October, early November. And I asked them just like, what sucks the most right now in your life? Like, what are you struggling with the most, right? I was starting a startup. I wanted to work on the thing that mattered the most. And the top 3 things they complained about were access controls, vulnerability management, and SaaS logs. And so vulnerability management, one of the things that I heard again and again was like, we have so many different vulnerabilities from so many different tools. We keep swapping out the detectors that we're using. We can't dedupe them between tools. I don't have a single place to see like my app phones and my network phones and my whatever else phones, and like I can't do that. And like, why can't I just get rid of a class of these phones? And so there was definitely a trend of people starting to move to some people just moving to like golden VM images, like people who hadn't done that yet, moving to the thing that Amazon provides by default or whatever, and I guess now Chainguard VMs, and then also a trend of people who are using containers moving to Chainguard and seeing the benefit of that.
Got it. And specifically for FedRAMP, what's the sort of requirement for vulnerability management, both on the remediation and reporting? Orion or Ken, if either of you want to take that one.
So I'm aware of 30, 90, 180. Yeah. Something that's interesting in my experience with product security, that's my background is extensively in product and application security, much like Checkmark's platform. Most companies don't get to the mediums and lows in their programs, and all of a sudden, if you've made the commitment to drive FedRAMP, you now must remediate lows with it, or have a plan, put it on the POAM, whatever it may be. You have to address all the way to lows within a certain amount of time. And so it really just adds an overhead to your kind of delivery capacity. And this is actually when it comes to the build versus buy, this is the huge selling point for leveraging Chainguard images is these get remediated. You just have to swap out your image, and you pick up a lot of the latest and greatest, and obviously not libraries and SAST vulnerabilities, but a major piece to the puzzle is the CVEs on the OS and container level.
For those less familiar with the FedRAMP alphabet salad, what's a POAM?
Plan, actions, and milestones, something like that.
Plan of actions and milestones.
There we go.
Yeah.
It's basically a risk register. So even when you get done stigging a server, and it'll say, hey, Bluetooth is still enabled, and it may not be. It might be a false positive. You still have to document it. You have to wave your hands a little bit. And then they say, yep, and it'll live forever on the POAM.
Orion, I think you ran into this at scale, right? Which is you're writing these mitigation statements, and at one image, one person, that's fine. But as you scale across multiple products, customers, that adds up. Can you talk about that a little bit more?
Yeah, it's very frustrating, right? Because they have different requirements on what they take, and kind of how we got into Chainguard. I'll take a step back, is we used to use these images that the DoD put out called Iron Bank, and they had this myth of reciprocity, right? So if anybody's worked in the DoD or used these before, the idea was it was a golden image. You could take it. All the vulnerabilities, those lows, mediums, or whatever, were accepted kind of DoD-wide. There was a memo, and as long as you built on those containers, you were good. And we were building on them for a long time, and then we got burned one day because they pulled that reciprocity memo. And then now everybody wanted their own explanations of why those vulnerabilities had to exist and what your POAM for it to risk reduce it was, and it just became hard to scale. It's kind of a pun, talk about scale the company, right? But we were spending more time writing mitigation statements or putting it in the format they wanted and having those conversations with customers than we were actually having our software in the environment so they could get value from it. So that was one of the big things we got from Chainguard, is I could just cut it off at its source and just avoid all of that conversation and get my software into these environments faster.
Maya, any best practices for CV mitigation that you picked up from those 60 CISOs, or any learnings that you want to share?
No, I think, like I said, it was really about eliminating classes of vulnerabilities. I think it was 2 things. I think it was adapting to the reality that your vulnerability scanners are going to change constantly, and that you're going to have many different vulnerability scanners that you're constantly, oh, we don't like this one anymore, we're going to roll out a new one next year. Oh, now we have to support Rust. Oh, now we have to whatever, and they're like constantly doing that. So I think just accepting that that's the reality, and like you're going to need to have a whole bunch of different kinds of vulnerability scanners and vulnerabilities to handle. And I think the second thing was like what people wanted were anything that would eliminate a class of vulnerabilities. And so I think what Chainguard is doing obviously does that. I did talk to a CISO who, this is like, to me, is crazy. This is possible to happen as a security person. But they worked with their head of engineering, and they said, there's only 2 ecosystems that we're ever going to support in this organization. And it's a big organization. And being able to just lock that down to saying, we will just never have anything that's not like, you can tell what industry they're in, that's not Rust or Python. That means that like we don't have to support all the other things. We don't have to worry about securing all the other things, right? So I think anything that can eliminate those kinds of classes of vulnerabilities is what people want to be doing.
Yeah, and for all of you, when we talk about FIPS, STIGs, vulnerability management, we're almost like talking about this mirror world that you create just for FedRAMP. How do you think about aligning that with like your sort of commercial environment or other environments that you're maintaining, and like juggling these 2 different worlds?
So within Checkmarks, we made the decision to apply the baseline across all of our environments. So we don't have a variation. We may turn some bells and whistles on or off for the FedRAMP space. It goes through a different continuous monitoring and tracking for POEM and sort of that piece. But by evolving the solution to meet FedRAMP, we really locked down and secured the rest of our environments by doing so.
Yeah, I'd like to jump in there too. One of the things Scale did when I started, Scale was much smaller when I started, kind of on the bleeding edge of everything. And I was the second security hire overall, but the first one who had any sort of federal experience, right? I came from Boeing, kind of largely doing this for flight simulators around the world. And we made the clear distinction to not slow down product velocity on the commercial side by keeping this separate in a federal-only environment, because there is a bunch of extra hurdles you have to jump through to have that baseline. And there was like images that we had that just weren't doable, like VLLM. Chainguard now supports it because we asked them to do it. Because I couldn't go to them like, you can't use that tool because there's no way I can get it FIPS, or there's no way I can get it compliant. So we would just move forward and do it. But what we found, which is really neat, is that investment we made in like the DoD world on the enterprise side has paid dividends, because now as we've grown, we're starting to do more public sector around the world, and then large enterprises as well. So like as the AI world matured, the investment we did there, we're now taking that, shifting it all left, and moving those containers and the process and the builds into our commercial environment, because they have the same needs, the same requirements now, and the supply chain is kind of caught up around us. But it's basically because we were able to outsource it to Chainguard to do a lot of that heavy lifting for us.
I'll actually jump in too, which is like, I think that part of the reason people historically separated federal environments versus non-federal environments in the products that they were building is that it was the FIPS crypto was not like patched enough, right? So like you don't want to have a version of a library that it has a current vulnerability, but if you can get that patched in your environment as quickly as possible, then like who cares? Like it can be one environment, right? You're not putting the rest of your customer base at risk because you have to use a particular version that the government mandates.
And how do you get buy-in internally, right? Because at what time you're raising the level for one environment, you're trying to standardize it for your other teams, and obviously large companies like Checkmarks, Scale, GitHub, you're not dealing with one persona or one team, but sort of a distributed base of stakeholders.
So for us, we have one code base for each of our services. It became an exercise of discussing through how unmanageable it would become to have various streams for our code bases. And we have 130 custom services that drive our solution. And we want to continue to evolve our multi-tenant SaaS product, and we'll be a little downstream on the FedRAMP side, but eventually continually kind of like certifying pieces to go all the way through. But 130 services and having different kind of code bases for each was going to be a bit of a nightmare for us to manage.
Got it. That's great. I I was hoping that maybe you guys could give a little bit of background on why you maybe pursued FedRAMP, and Maya could share some context on why FedRAMP is becoming sort of increasingly important for the government to adopt commercial software. Feel free for anyone to
Sure,
start.
I can jump in, I guess, on this. So I think if for folks who go even back to the beginning, who don't know why anyone would get FedRAMP, so if you were going to sell software to the government, you'd have to go through a certain process as defined in FISMA to sell on-prem software. So FedRAMP was introduced maybe 20 years ago now to help you sell cloud-based software, where cloud is IaaS, PaaS, or SaaS software, and they publish a set of requirements, and you have to go through the process that we talked about earlier, authorization to sell to different entities. I don't. Part of the reason I dug into the data is I was like, I don't know why people are talking about FedRAMP more these days. And the data, as I kind of expected, told me that people are using more FedRAMP based cloud products, but not why. Obviously, you don't. Yeah, I can't go ask someone at the Department of Veterans Affairs why they're buying more cloud-based software. But my hypothesis is a couple of things. I think one, just in general, all of us are continue to be moving more to the cloud. Some of these government agencies look a lot more like these stodgier companies that we've had in the world in the last couple of years, and are finally adopting Slack and Okta and Salesforce and like some of these apps that all of us are used to using all the time. I think another part of it is that if you are selling a more sophisticated application to the government that has a bunch of dependencies, all of those dependencies also have recently gotten FedRAMP authorization, and therefore you can use them and sell them as part of your application as well. So like if you're selling, again, let's take Okta as an example. If you're selling something to the government and they can log in with an SSO provider, that SSO provider is almost certainly Okta. That they can log into your application with, right? And that's because Okta is already FedRAMP authorized, and you can depend on that in your product. The fact that AWS offers a GovCloud or GCP or Azure or whoever, it makes it just so much easier to go build software that is easier to get accepted in the government than it was even 5 or 10 years ago.
So to echo that quite a bit with the critical mass, it has become easier over time to get FedRAMP. So like when I Scale started this process 3.5 years ago. It's probably closer to 4. I got involved 3.5 when I started. You had to self-host a lot of it, right? Like if you wanted to run, like Okta didn't have a FedRAMP tenant. You had to run your own AD stack. You had to do all these things by hand, and it was very hard. You had to build your entire thing. But as more SaaS offerings has grown, it's becoming easier to do because you can offload that to other SaaS companies. But prior to that, though, they were building their own data centers, and they still do. They weren't using the cloud, and most of the agencies are still pretty skeptical of it. There's entire agencies hey, we won't touch cloud products. Yeah, I know you have FedRAMP, I know you have a DoD PA, but we still want you to deploy it internally. And that conversation is slowly changing when you show them hey, here's how much we spend in cloud costs today. To run the Scale platform and all AI models is X. You guys can do that. We're happy to do it, and we're going to charge you to run it, but you're going to have a negative user experience and it's going to be less secure because we don't have our security monitoring around it. We don't have the automation in place. We're not going to be able to update those vulnerabilities and push features out as fast. And they're slowly starting to see that and buy into it, which is really nice.
So for Checkmarks, our historical legacy product has always been on-premise. And with our latest SaaS kind of our newest platform, it is not an on-premise software. We've had the request basically from our client base to kind of go towards this route, and it really opens up the total addressable market for us to tap into.
Awesome. Ken, all right, I want to give you guys a chance to kind of talk more specifically about your journey with Chainguard. So
Sure.
Ken, maybe if you want to kind of take us through your full story and share your own experiences.
Sure. So just for full disclosure, we're going through the process right now. We do not have an ATO at the moment. We've been going through the audit interviews and all the fun pieces. So we're in the works. So it was around a year ago. We were voluntold that we will do FedRAMP, and I was like, "Are you sure?" And they were like, "Yes." And then began the deep dive into what it takes to bridge the product gaps and remediate a lot of the issues that we had. At the time, we were using the free Chainguard images. We were building a golden image flow to clean our whatever images we can get our hands on for free. We were using them, and then so it was like a really quick let's explore Red Hat Chainguard to start exercising getting FIPS images and getting them clean and having it kind of a build versus buy conversation. Part of the journey was we didn't know all the nooks and crannies within our architecture. Like I said, by the time you're deploying our product, it's about 180 services, and so we quickly were like, we don't know what we don't know. And one of the great things with Chainguard has been that I was up front. I'm like, I think I need these images, and then like every day, I'm like, hey, can you switch this for this and that for this? And it's just been a journey for the last year, and I think we've solidified our base images we deploy into our GovCloud right now. We're as clean as you can be, and we had to stig our own AMI if we had to do that for every image. I put here endless hours. I can't even like quantify it. Like we just wouldn't make it. And so just 6 months is an understatement, but we have third-party images that would just be taxing to get to the end of job, whether it's traffic, load balancer controller. Amazon brings probably 20 different base images to the table in the Golang community just to have all the EBS integrations. Just something to keep in mind for anyone that's jumping into the Amazon world. There's a lot of things aren't covered. And so, yeah, within an 8-month period, we got from 0 to hero pretty quickly. And so here we are, hopefully getting to the finish line. I know it takes more time, longer than probably leadership wants.
That's terrific. And Orion, how about you?
Yeah, I'll kind of take it a step back to when I was at Boeing and kind of, you talk about the untold hours of stuff that needs to be done to do this. So Boeing, while I love Boeing, the cost plus contracting kind of has this like negativity to it, to where these requirements are fine when you can throw bodies at it, right? Like, okay, it's going to take 100 people working a year to do this. Boeing's like, fine, that's perfect. Like, we'll do that all day to do this by hand. Scale does not have 100 people to dedicate to staging machines and images to do that, because we sell a software product, right? But we have to be compliant and in those environments to do that and play ball. So what Chainguard really did for us was, and I've kind of covered a lot of this throughout the conversation already here, but we eliminated like 95% of our vulnerabilities, right? And we're still kind of doing this migration because we're moving very fast. There's more to buy. We kind of came last minute at the audit when I think it was last year, right? When the reciprocity memo got taken back and we got called on it, we're like, oh, hey, we thought we were good on these, and now we had thousands of lows we had to patch and mediums that we're just kind of ignoring because we thought we had reciprocity on them. So that was the big thing. So just eliminating it, and then as you move into different environments, because even though FedRAMP, you do have SaaS providers, but like I said today, we have multiple customers that don't trust it. We're trying to get reciprocity right now from a customer, and they don't like our current package, and they literally said, well, hey, you guys have more than 15 containers. We can only support 5. Like, so you pick your best 5 containers for your software, and we'll do this. And like, just because they have no concept of what's working, because they imagine those 5 containers are going to take hours and hours of like vulnerability reviews and all these things. So that's where it was coming from. We're like, no, there's no vulnerabilities. Like, our scans are clean, and we're more than happy to give them to you and run them in your environment. Because they also don't understand containers. Like, I had a conversation, like, I was late to this conference today because I was on the call with the government, and they wanted to scan our containers in a different environment, not with different tools, just to say, like, okay, we scanned it high side. I was like, it's a container. It works exactly the same. It's hashed. Like, it's good. But they don't understand that. And I don't always win that battle. I won it earlier today. That they're going to take the scans from the low side and just let us move them up that we already have. But every vulnerability I eliminate at its source is one I don't have to explain per customer, per environment, and kind of track and manage throughout its entire life cycle, right? The neat thing about this, and we touched on it earlier, is as we've grown and matured, we landed a pretty large deal with a large government customer outside the US. And when you go to their requirements, and I know this from Boeing, most foreign companies, non-US countries rather, leverage like the NIST standards for what they're doing. So they call out FIPS encryption. So you think you're working with a foreign government, you're not going to have to deal with FIPS. It's in the requirements that we have. So a lot of this work we've done on our public sector side, we're now able to shift to international public sector and grow that pretty seamlessly because we already did the heavy lifting, in large part doing the Chainguard containers and doing this migration. So,
Awesome. I don't know, Maya. I don't know if you want to add anything from your previous lives at GitHub or Tailscale as it relates to FedRAMP. I know not specifically Chainguard.
I have part of the reason I'm sort of an anomaly here is I've never actually worked on a product that had to go through FedRAMP while I worked on it. So I saw a lot of the planning and I saw a lot of the after effects. But that's why I did a lot of the data analysis of like, what am I actually getting myself into if I do this? No, I think the thing that has always worried me personally the most has been the FIPS compliance, like I kind of talked about earlier. I used to work in encryption, and the idea that you're like pinned to some version that the government said was okay, but is like so far behind what the open source version is the thing that scares me. It's like, oh, okay, so you're telling me I should be less secure to sell to the government. That's always been the thing that kind of freaks me out about it. But it's the reality of kind of how this works.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, we wanted to leave plenty of time at the end for Q&A, so we'll open it up now. We have folks running mics around, and we'll have anyone take questions. Right.
I have two questions. I live in this bifurcated world. How are you implementing, if you can talk about it, your Conmon? And then, what was my other question? Are you planning for CATO as well in the future?
So I will jump in that Conmon changed yesterday. So if you haven't gone and looked at the new FedRAMP 20X requirements, Conmon is, I think, no longer the agency's responsibility or something, and they're going to publish more guidance soon.
Maybe Ken or Ryan define what Conmon has meant to date,
Yeah.
and how you all have approached it, and then we'll also answer your CATO question.
So for us, we've actually have a strategic partner to help us with like the surrounding pieces for Conmon, and we have a standard set of whether it's scanners and ticketing playbooks, and we just we leverage some experts in this space to kind of you saw we have timing kind of dilemmas, and they bring a lot of the pieces to the table, and so. Yeah, we just it's a weekly process for us where we talk through everything that was built, changed in the environment, tickets, vulnerabilities, and reacting to them, and that's how it's gone so far for us.
Yeah, we actively have our ATO and the FedRAMP High accreditation. We also have the DIS IL4. We do use a strategic partner to do a lot of the continuous monitoring requirements for us, like a managed service provider. But it's been my experience that they call it continuous monitoring, but it's largely just that POEM every month that you do. So those kind of go hand in hand. Yeah.
So it's more like a change log than.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
I think I broke it. Oh, no, okay. There we go. Yeah, it's a terrible experience, right? I have a lot of customers that are trying to figure that out as well, and some are doing it pretty well, and some aren't. So they're always asking for advice from my team.
We've been able to argue, we do change management, right? But we tie it to the PRs, and then we have the PRs be the approved change board, so they can kind of run async. And we've been able to argue that successfully to the auditors for it.
And then that kind of leads into the CATO. Or is that something you're getting ready for? You're planning for?
I've asked about it a few times to various customers because that was what we were gearing up for when I was at Boeing, when I was leading the DevSecOps team before I came to Scale. And I've never seen anybody, at least of the agencies I've worked with, that actually have a CATO program. You ask them about it, they're like, sounds cool, yeah, we'd love to get that, but they don't have it. So I've never actually done it. I think we were capable of doing it. We could get to it, but no one's actually doing it within the government that I'm aware of, maybe.
It takes a special person, I think, inside the government to make that happen.
Yeah.
I think we had a question over here.
Wait, I'm getting there. I'm gonna sneak across. Okay, I'm going direct. Okay, thank you.
So it sounds like Chainguard resolves a lot of the pain around the FedRAMP process because it reduces a lot of the paperwork burden, right? But it sounds like there's still quite a bit of pain involved in the FedRAMP process to the extent that you've had to hire an external company to help manage that. If you had a magic wand today and you could eliminate part of that process or improve part of that process, looking into this FedRAMP 20X, like what would that look like for your organization? How would that process change?
You're gonna have to get you guys on the working groups.
No, there's a lot of like archaic requirements that don't make sense nowadays, and like a lot of my job as like the lead and kind of architect for this is like figuring out what to push back on and then what just to bite the bullet and do, right? So they still have like pretty like tiered kind of architectures that don't really make sense in a cloud native environment. They're like, well, no, the first hop has to be this. You're like, well, no one does it like that anymore. So there's a lot of that. There's a lot of like education, a lot of like, okay, just bite the bullet and do it. I would like to see better understanding of like containers, and if they're going to do it, have like actual hardening guides. Like there is no STIGs that I'm aware of like for securing Kubernetes today. Like there's like some NSA guidance, but it's kind of vague. That's the biggest one. It's very geared still around building large like VM instances and farms, like from a accreditation standpoint. My experience.
I can't help but feel as I was going through the process that I was like, are we the first ones to ever use EKS in this world? Yeah. And not just that, but there's a lot of riddles and rhymes going through this process. And if you haven't lived in the world of the federal space, like I'm translating it to all of R&D in Israel and Portugal, and they have more questions. I'm like, I don't know. And then I go back and I try to learn from our consultants, and it's like, oh, just read the 410 controls. And it's like, okay, so, and most of them are archaic. Yeah. It's like you're running Active Directory. Do you have local admins? And in the cloud world, most of what they're asking for aren't relevant anymore. And so to your point, yes, there's a lot of issues get resolved by using Chainguard at our application level, but I'd say most of the federal requirements are not just at the application level. And when going through the audit, they pick apart mostly access control, least privileges, and networking, and then of course FIPS everywhere. These were kind of the main heavy points getting through audit.
How are you validating that? Is it just, hey, here's some YAML, this is how we have it set up, or is it?
You show enough things that say FIPS until the auditor is happy. I don't want to give away too many of my secrets, but you show a screen that says FIPS equals 1. But yeah, every single piece had a little special, like, we had a STIG that was in YAML that was on EC2 image builder. We hardened our images so you can't shell onto anything, and they're like, you got to shell on and run this command. I'm like, I can't do that. And they're like, you have to do that. I'm like, okay, here's FIPS. See, it says FIPS equals 1.
I actually want to lean in a little bit on this topic. I think it's really interesting. So if you think about the concept of like business level security, you have what you're running in production. There's what you have within the engineering environment. There's also maybe your application security organization, and then you have your GRC and InfoSec partners, right? There's a lot, there can be a lot of complexity to what we mean when we say security and compliance. So one of the things I'm wondering is if, let's say, at a moderately sized company, probably your number one contact and the person who's responsible for ensuring continued ATO from a relationship management is someone who's mostly have a legal background. Right, so how do you facilitate the transition, or how have you found facilitating the translation of the technical, sort of, going back to a lot of the things just make no sense technically, and we have to figure out how to explain that, right? So, like, what sort of tooling or ease of access for understanding have you built into your overarching sort of business systems to help facilitate this?
I don't know if we
No pressure.
No.
I don't have an answer.
I don't know if we've built things into the system. Like, to me, it's a people problem. So, like, I generally have hired people that are security people that can talk to customers and articulate and be people oriented. Like I know most of us are probably introverts and you're terrified of being upstage like here, but we hire people who can have conversations, make them laugh, and then we get them embedded with the customers that are friends with them. So like I have my compliance counterpart, friend Donahue, like used to work at DoD CIO and knows these people, worked with them, is like the most bubbly, friendly people person, like probably would be great in sales, but she handles that relationship and does it very well for us. And we're able to like get those questions answered, and like they listen to us because they know Friend, they know her face, they know her. Like, so find yourself a friend, I guess. Don't take my friend, please, but find one. I think they're very helpful.
By the way, how many of you, we've talked about FedRAMP 20X a little bit, how many of you watched the FedRAMP webinar yesterday with the director of FedRAMP? How many of you? So as you might have heard from the folks up here, FedRAMP is possibly changing. With the idea being that some of the things that Orion and Ken and Maya talked about of this sort of like manual, paper-based approach to make that more automated. So instead of saying, look at this FIPS word on my doc, you can actually continuously validate that you have FIPS on. I don't know if you guys have a perspective you wanted to share on the news that came out yesterday or anything you guys are thinking about.
I always have hot takes on everything, so I'm always ready. So I think it was interesting to read the news. First of all, if you read the press release, it looks like a little bit AI generated. Just some of the wording doesn't super make sense, but ignore that. The main thing that they're sort of taking credit for is saying, hey, we're going to make, we're going to have this like digital authorization process. It's going to be so much easier. And it's like, okay, well, FedRAMP's actually been working on that for like 18 months. It's not a new thing that they haven't done. They have, like I said, like a public repo. You can go look at these examples. They haven't rolled it out yet, but it's something they've been working on and testing and getting feedback on for a long time already. I think one of the other things that was interesting to me is that the announcement says we're going to do a lot of these things for FedRAMP Low. And I was like, FedRAMP Low? I think there's 19 FedRAMP Low uses. It is like not the thing that people do. You generally, like the vast majority of people get moderate. It's like 70% of the uses. If you're going to go for low, you go for what's called low impact SaaS, which is that only your login data is data that needs to be secured separately. And so that already qualified for like this slightly easier process. And so I think what they're trying to say is we're going to make that even easier. And it's like, well, I don't know if we're just going to repackage it or if you're actually changing anything. That's not super clear. My real hot take is I think this is a little bit what you were just saying earlier, Ryan, and we're like, you have one agency that you've been working with and then you talk to another agency and they're like, oh, I don't know if I trust that person's, whatever. It's like, if you're going through this process if you're going through FedRAMP authorization under this new world where maybe nobody actually sponsors you, and you've met some checkboxes for this automated process, I'm not convinced anyone's gonna be convinced enough to buy you based on that. Like if I were the CIO of like the Department of, I don't know, what's a department that I'd be? The Department of Commerce. I'd look at that and I would be like, why would I trust some automated online thing to say that like this product is good enough to buy? I'd still want to run my own process. And so I guess I'm not convinced that it's going to change a whole lot. I think it's actually probably going to make everything much harder to sell to the government is my hot take. But we'll see.
Yeah. What about you guys? Any last takes?
Yeah, so I think when I first started this journey, I was told FedRAMP doesn't recognize DevOps and continuous delivery. And so I think we're at the beginning of probably what will become lots of change in this space. If they're going to open up Pandora's box in the cloud native world, it's going to be an endless kind of like, much like everyone else has to be iterative and incremental with what they do. I think this will also have a wave of that while trying to keep within the intent of being secure. But what do I know? I don't know. I'm just making all this up. So
I want to go back to what I would change, and it's actually forcing reciprocity. Like that's the biggest thing. If you could wave a magic wand and say, hey, there's a standard, we met the standard, you're allowed to buy it, no questions asked, I think would go a long way to making the process easier. Because even if it's terrible, once you're through it, and then you can sell. But once you're through it, you keep doing it again and again for new customers, and it doesn't reduce the cost for the government at all.
Awesome. Any last questions?
This is for the check marks one. So you had mentioned that your software moved from an old software which was on-prem to SaaS, and that's why you had to get through FedRAMP. If you still stay on your old software and you're able to sell it through FIPS, was it worth the effort, the return to go to a new SaaS with FedRAMP? Like, what's your product strategy? Just trying to understand that.
Well, so our legacy kind of product, it's just that, it's legacy. So we have some older Windows-based application, like it's basically what made our company. So, I can only say so much ill about it. It's actually done very well. It's best of breed SaaS product, but the future for Checkmarx is CX1, which is our modern platform, which is an all-encompassing platform for application security, where our legacy is just SaaS, only SaaS, and so it's not the cost of maintaining it and the developers that we have and just total cost of ownership. It's not worth the investment. So it's a matter of open up the potential avenue where we have this platform. From a sales perspective, we're selling 8 things instead of the 1. So if you come over here, we're helping you protect your whole stack from a security perspective. Over here, just doing SaaS. So from a just pure product capability perspective, we don't want to just keep over here on this side. And while we do have a few self-managed customers, it's just such a cloud native Kubernetes, horribly complex to manage. Giving it to the client to run in their environment, it's just not gone well. And so we're really focused on let us manage, let us operate, let's get authorized, and then we'll bring over any federal use cases we can.
Awesome. Well, I know we're at time. I want to thank you guys again so much for making the time, coming on stage, answering everyone's questions. I really enjoyed the conversation. And yeah, thank you.